Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation that I had with Dick. Some of you are new around here, and so we've decided to rebroadcast some episodes. In my humble opinion, Dick is an amazing storyteller, so settle in to hear Dick's F1 origin story, passion for racing, and how he continues to pursue his unfinished dreams. I'm sure you'll walk away appreciating Dick. I know I do. But before we get to the conversation, I need to take a moment to ask, have you subscribed to or followed the show on your favorite podcast app? Have you shared the show with your fellow F1 fans? If not, can you take a moment to do so now? For an indie podcast like us, that's how we grow. You taking these small actions. And we are growing thanks to you. The guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, I am super excited for today's conversation. I think the fact that you and I have actually never been in the same physical space, we are recording without actually ever really seeing each other's face. I feel such a connection and inspiration of knowing you in the time that I've already known you. And you've given me some of the highlights of your story, but I feel like I'm going to learn as much as our audience is going to learn about what has brought you into the sport and specifically your love for F1. So I'm hoping this will be a relaxed, fun conversation, which all conversations with you are fun, but even more than normal because it'll just be the two of us. So let me start by saying F1 has historically been a sport in Europe, but you're an American. All three of us are Americans. Why are you a fan of F1? Like, how did you get connected?
Well, great question. I got interested in Formula One 55 years ago. This was back in the days when, if I was lucky, I would get to see the highlights from the Grand Prix of Monaco on ABC a week after the fact. And otherwise, I was reading race reports in Road and Track. At the time, Road and Track magazine would carry all the race reports. They were written by a guy named Rob Walker, who was the heir to the Johnny Walker distillery fortune. And he was a gentleman owner. This was back in the days when a gentleman owner could go to Lotus or whoever and purchase a Formula One car and all the needed spares and pull together a team and go and compete in Formula One races. And of course, those days are long gone. But this gentleman, Rob Walker, he was very much just this avid sportsman, and his love for Formula One came through in the pages of Road and Track magazine for, 10-year-old me. And I would read his articles about the 1968 British Grand Prix when his car actually won. And I would read it and reread it and read it again to the point where I was just practically there. The photography was great. It was really easy for me to immerse myself in Formula One and feel like, that I really had experienced it, even though no TV, very, very little would you ever see it, being broadcast other than Monaco. So that's really kind of what did it for me. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer, I certainly was interested in other forms of racing, particularly IndyCar, and still am. And back in those days, Formula One and IndyCar were very much more comparable to each other than you would find them today from a technical standpoint and all that. Of course, today, the F1 car way more complex than the Indy car. But then again, you're not running the risk of, putting a Formula One car into the wall at Indianapolis at 240 miles an hour. So you want strength as opposed to complexity. So you build them for different reasons, right?
That's right. Yeah. So did you, because you were bringing up IndyCar, it makes me think, was it like your friends when you were a kid, do they think you were a little odd because you liked Formula One and weren't doing more of the focus in the IndyCar? Or was that kind of normal? People who enjoyed motorsport and racing, liking all the different forms?
I was the only guy that was like a real racer in my group of kids that I ran around with.
Okay.
And so I was always considered a little bit of the oddball, especially when I actually started racing myself, because I developed a real attitude about the guys that were the football players and basketball players and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I played basketball too, but it was just sort of like, yeah, okay, you might be able to, twist an ankle or, take an elbow to the chest or something like that, but you haven't had your bells rung until you've crashed. And so, I had this attitude, and they all kind of looked at me like, okay, this guy is definitely wired differently, which is true. I am wired differently. So,
So, in your family, were they into racing?
No. Interestingly enough, I think my dad was always a little bit of a closet racer. He always owned some really cool sports cars, Porsches, and he had a Mercedes 190 SL and, a number of different cars. I actually learned to drive at 10 years old in a Triumph sports car that my dad bought for my mom as a Mother's Day gift, but he wasn't fooling anybody. That was actually a car for him to drive because my mom was shepherding around, two kids, and you can't actually fit two kids even in a little sports car, and we were little at the time. But yeah, that car was actually for him to go drive on the weekends. So,
Oh, that's so great. I love it. Okay, so then tell me, you've attended races, both like karting and all the different kinds of races, obviously, but also
sure.
Grand Prix. So my question really is, take me back to one of the ones that you really remember that just will always stick in your head.
Oh, easily it was the 1980 United States Grand Prix at Long Beach. The guy that eventually became my best man, his name's Pete. Pete at the time was living out in California with his parents. We've been friends since fifth grade. And so we were both in college, and it just turned out that when we compared calendars, our spring break for senior year, they were identical spring breaks. And so Pete says, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't you come out here, spend the week with me? We'll go to the U.S. Grand Prix, play golf, go snow skiing, and hit the beach all at once. And I was like, man, not a tough sell to a 22-year-old guy, and so we headed off to, I flew out to California, and we went to the Long Beach Grand Prix, and the support race was the Formula Atlantics, which were absolutely amazing racing cars. They don't race them professionally anymore, but there's plenty of them still around racing, amateur racing and all that, and it's just amazing. And then there was the Formula One race itself, and interesting side story, the guy that introduced me to John is a guy named Sean Jones, who is literally a Jerry Maguire kind of guy, but specializes in racing drivers. And he's put together a number of IndyCar teams and has been involved in Formula One. But the crazy part is that his dad actually owned a Formula One team back in those days. As it turned out, we spent a lot of time in the garage area right next to that car that his dad owned. And of course, at the time, I didn't know Sean. I didn't know Sean until about 20 years later. And yet I realized that that I was at the 1980, United States Grand Prix at Long Beach with two of my very best friends, all within 10 feet of each other. And I only knew one of them of the three of us. And since that time, of course, my friend Pete has gotten to know Sean, and they're certainly friendly and have conversations around business and all that. It's just an amazing story, and it just goes to show that the world truly is small.
I love that. I love how something so big and historic also has the personal aspect of it. That's the thing that I think, as I've been getting in deeper into the world of F1, I've admired the complexity that results not just on the technical and all that, but also the human aspect of this. So I love that story. So, what about when we look at the sport, you've seen it evolve as a longtime fan. How do you feel about that? When you look at, our tagline is past, present, and future. Do you like where you see the past has moved into the present and where the present is going into the future?
I think the answer is yes and no. Let me go back to 10-year-old self, okay? 10-year-old self just assumed that somewhere between 2 and 5 racing drivers, my heroes, were going to get killed every year. And by the time I was 16 years old, something like that, people would talk about somebody getting killed and all that. And I'd already gotten kind of jaded to it because it was just kind of normal. And that's not good. I, for one, believe that kids do not need to see their heroes getting killed. On the other hand, It is a dangerous sport. It always has been dangerous. And I think that danger still needs to be there to a certain degree. It's very, very hard for me to explain. And as the father of, young people who are now in their, one's in his early 30s and the other in mid 20s, I would have a real hard time as a parent knowing that my kid had been killed in a car race, right? So there's a real conflict going on there. But all that being said, even though I think they're incredibly ugly, I'm really glad that the cars now have a halo. All the safety and the carbon fiber tubs that they now construct with the cars and all that. And then the fact that the circuits they're so much safer now and all that. I think that goes a long way towards it, because what they're doing is still incredibly difficult and it's still incredibly dangerous. As we saw last year at the British Grand Prix when Joe went upside down. Yeah, huge wreck, right? So, and thankfully he was okay, because that's the other side of it. Every once in a while, you kind of want to see somebody just wad a car and then step out of it and walk away. You know, I mean, it's kind of like, they come walking back to the pits carrying the steering wheel and say, "Oh, sorry guys, I kind of went over the limit." You kind of want to see that. The other part is, of course, is that Formula One, I think it's to its discredit that it has become such a money thing. It's such big business. We've seen it destroy some of these young people, some to the point where they just never are able to come back. Others where they've had to go back and retrench. You've seen it with Pierre Gasly. They move him up to Red Bull, and it the pressure just destroyed him. Alex Albon, Mick Schumacher. I mean, the list just goes on, right? And so to a certain degree of that, you say, yeah, but, it's a big boys game, suck it up. And on the other hand, that's not exactly fair either, because it's enormous pressure. And so there's that part. But the other part that I think that is really sad is that you can't have today a Rob Walker show up and say, "You know what, I think I'd like to have a Formula One team." And he goes out and buys somebody else's car, puts it on the grid, and then gives a young, deserving driver a shot at becoming a Formula One driver. There were always 2 or 3 guys like that through the 60s and 70s who would do that, who had the money and bad judgment to go and do that. You think about Lord Hesketh. He was a big racing fan. He loved James Hunt. And so he funded him into Formula One, and they won a race.
Right.
You think about it. I mean, they had no backing at all. It was all out of Lord Hesketh's pocket. And yet they won a race. Right. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so, right. And so some of that stuff is just missing today, and it makes the sport a bit antiseptic, I think.
Wow. There's so many good points that I walk away from what you just said. One is actually connected to a conversation. I do not know if the order of how it will air in comparison to what this conversation, but it was when we were talking about James Hunt and the race with Niki Lauda in Japan. And I was struggling for a word. I said, I want to use the word reckless, but I feel like that's the wrong word. And after I thought about it for a long time, I thought the word is not reckless, it's relentless. And that was what was really driving, I think, Hunt. And when I listen to you and when I hear what you're saying about what earlier eras and the safety, nobody wants it to be less safe, because we believe in these human beings' lives. We want those to continue. Right. And the safety aspect of this, I feel like when in the mental image I have in my head as I listen to you was like, it's on a razor's edge. But the safety doesn't diminish the skill of the driver that we are asking them to pursue in a really, going back to what you just said, a complex machine. And so, and the other part, when I hear you say about a gentleman, you said a gentleman owner, like Rob Walker, it's like having that person who says, you know what, I see you, I'm going to take that chance on you because I can see your raw skill, or if you just have that backing, I can cut through all of that. I can see where you're coming from there are people like out there that have just given that chance could reach that top 20 grid. And so your perspective of the evolution and the areas where yes and no, your answer, I can see why. And in many ways, even as a newer fan, I think maybe I have an old soul of wanting to go back to the older era. And some of
Yeah.
the stuff when I've listened
Yeah.
to you guys, I think, oh, I feel like I want to go back to that era and see racing like that. But I also love what we're seeing on the grid right now too, especially when you guys
Yes.
explain to me so much of the technical and all the things that as a newer person I may not grasp, which is why I hope that our audience will see the value of this kind of intergenerational fan conversation
Right.
is important for the sport. So that way,
Oh,
as
yeah.
progress happens, it's a good thing for all of us, that for us to
Right.
remember where it has historically been. So, okay, let me ask
Yeah.
you this question. The expansion and like what newer people coming in, especially in the United States, what do you
Hmm.
attribute that to? And do you think this is just like a momentary thing, like a moment in the sun, or a substantial shift of how Americans are viewing F1?
I think you had to have a number of things happen. I think first of
Mm-hmm.
all, Formula One needed a permanent home. It had bounced around from way too many tracks. Really, Formula One was doing pretty well in the United States when they raced at Watkins Glen, and then it moved away. And they made a bunch of attempts to put Formula One in a parking lot at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas and the streets of Phoenix, and the try at Indianapolis. The logic behind it really hard to argue with, but it just didn't work for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
And some good old Texas entrepreneurs went and rolled the dice and said, "I got an idea. Let's build a racetrack in Austin." As outlandish as it sounds, it makes sense that a bunch of Texans would say, "Oh yeah, Texans are used to the idea of either putting people on top of cylinders with high explosives and launching them into orbit, or drilling holes in the ground. Either one is super risky, right?" And so it's sort of like, build a racetrack, what the hell? And
Right.
so they went and did it, and it worked. It worked. They found a way to make it work. And we were going to F1 races in 2012, 2013. I mean, it wasn't 400,000 people for the weekend, but it was 300,000. Still a lot of people. And so along comes, Drive to Survive, which is great drama. Some of it has been manufactured, I think. Some of it is for real. Certainly the personalities are being shown. And so, that has caused a bunch of people to take notice who wouldn't otherwise have taken notice. And I think it's like if you think of it as a marketing campaign, I think like any marketing campaign, there's a certain level of stickiness. You're going to get a group of people who are going to get really, really excited about it. And then after a while, that excitement will kind of wither and die, and they'll go find hooked on pickleball. But there's going to be others who are going to stick and say, heck yeah, man, that's seriously cool stuff. When's the next race? And so, is it a moment in the sun? Yeah, a little bit. But the other side of it is that I do think that there's room for it to grow, because in many aspects, I've said it before on these podcasts, every Formula One race is essentially a Super Bowl. And Americans, more than anybody else in the world, get the idea of a Super Bowl. I think that, there's going to be I think it's going to be a substantial shift in terms of growth. It may not be maybe at the level that it's at now, but I still see the trajectory going up for a few more years, and then it may flatten and decline a little bit and then flatten out again, if you get my drift. But it's certainly going to be bigger 3 years from now than it was 10 years ago. That's my read. Yep.
Like you're saying is if we moved the analysis data starting point, regardless of where it ends, this era will be a growth from where we start, where it was.
Sure.
How long that's sustained, And like, if will it have incremental decrease, that's to be determined. But we will always say this was an increase.
Yep.
And I think that what you just said about people and how they came to this and their approach to F1 here in the United States and seeing the Super Bowl, you have said that before, and I loved that analogy because I think a lot of Americans can understand that. And I think it's one of the many amazing parts about the sport. So that leads me to this question. If you are one of those new fans and you are wanting to go past the layer of the drama, what do you think is some critical viewing or things to read to understand the sport?
I love this question.
Oh, good.
Because it's a great question, because I think that there's a lot of movies that have been made by Hollywood about racing. Most of them are horrible, and I would say stay away from them at all costs. There are a handful of movies, though, that have been produced over, call it 50 some odd years, that are worth watching, even though it's from different eras, but it gives you a different perspective. For example, I think it was in 1966, 1967, a movie called Grand Prix was released, okay? And there's people like James Garner and people like that in there. Basically what they did was they sent a film crew and followed Formula One at all of the races, Monaco, Spa, you name it, they followed it. They mounted 35 millimeter cameras on, I think about this, a 35 millimeter camera on a race car with film running through it, because there was no digital photography back then, right? It was all, it was film, man. They would rig these cars up and they would send them out and put them at the back of the grid and they'd go race. They were at the back of the pack for the Monaco Grand Prix. And what you see is photographers literally laying on the sidewalks of Monaco with no guardrail, nothing. It's sidewalk and racetrack. And they're taking pictures of these guys going past it, however many, whatever, 150 miles an hour, getting just the right shot. Turn marshals standing in the same place, and all they have is a flag. You know, they have no safety gear, no fire extinguishers, nothing. You know, and if you just watch it for that, I mean, it's not a bad movie. I mean, you know, the love story sucks. Just go past it. You know, all that kind of stuff. But the racing scenes, rain in at Spa, with cars just flying off the road because, you know, they're on slicks and they didn't know it was raining on the other side of the circuit, because back in those days, Spa was 8 miles long, not 4 like it is today. And they're just cannoning off the track. And it's just like, oh my God, you know, these cars didn't have, you know, the full on safety harnesses that they have today, or the fuel cells, you know, to keep the gas tanks from erupting when there was a split and all that kind of stuff. Oh yeah, I mean, it's just it's crazy to watch. Steve McQueen made a movie called Le Mans back in 1969. It's about the 24-hour sports car race, and while it's not Formula One, it still is amazing because, again, they mounted cameras on these cars and they put them in the 24 hours of Le Mans. And Steve McQueen drove it.
Wow.
It was amazing. So those are two really good movies. There's another one called Weekend with a Champion. And it was, believe it or not, it was shot at the 1971 Monaco Grand Prix. And it was Roman Polanski, who was big buddies with Jackie Stewart. This is before Roman lost his mind and, you know, did all sorts of things that he shouldn't have done. But anyway, he took a 16 millimeter camera and just followed Jackie around for the whole weekend in his hotel room, walking down from the Hotel de Paris down to the garage area. And the garage area, everybody was literally stepping on top of each other. A little tiny garage, but all the cars were in one garage. It is an unbelievable video to watch. It was on Netflix. I don't know if it's still out there, but oh my gosh, it's so good.
Well, let me make sure I understood you correct, if you don't mind. You're saying all the cars were in the one garage, meaning all teams' cars were in one garage?
Yep. Oh, yeah. And they'd be doing debriefs. Like Jackie Stewart and his teammate was a race driver from France named Francois Chavert. And they're standing there with the team boss and the guy that designed the car. And they're actually talking about setup and do we go with this gear or this gear for first because we need it for the hairpin. And all of a sudden, Jackie stops. He goes, "Oh, those guys, you know, the Ferrari guys are listening. Let's go somewhere else." I mean, it was like that. It was like that. I mean, it's just sort of like,
Wow.
you got to be freaking kidding me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, it
that's
was
what I was
great.
like. I got to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. I can't even imagine that with the way that the teams behave now, them
Oh,
not
yeah.
having the dividers and individual garages. And wow, that's amazing. Okay, what about
Hmm.
anything specifically to read?
From a history standpoint, there's a book that's long out of print, but it's called Faster, A Racer's Diary by Jackie Stewart. That's absolutely an amazing book. And basically what it is it's his diary from the 1970 Grand Prix season when he lost two of his very best friends, were killed racing, Piers Courage and Jochen Rindt. You know, that was the year that he basically had a nervous breakdown and, you know, all that kind of stuff. That was quite a book. And I'm fortunate to not only have that book, I've got Sir Jackie's autograph on it.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah, it was great. And unfortunately, I did not get to meet Jackie. But what was interesting was I had been given that as a Christmas present from my grandparents, and you know, typical grandparent thing, right? You know, Merry
Oh.
Christmas, 1971, and you know, they signed it and all this. Well, years and years later, a buddy of mine was doing a program for Ford out at Laguna Seca Raceway out in California. And it was for Ford, and he got wind that Jackie Stewart was going to be there, and he knew I was a Stewart fan, and he knew about this book. And so he says, dude, can I take the book with me? And I'm going to get Sir Jackie to sign it for you. And so I said, yes, you know, one of those deals. And so he brings the book to Jackie, and Jackie opens it up and sees the deal, you know, that my grandparents had signed. And he says, oh my goodness, this is a Christmas present from his grandparents. And it really meant something to him, apparently.
Oh.
And anyway, we got this beautiful autograph, and I mean, he always prided himself on a really, you know, distinctive, legible autograph and all that, because you know Jackie was dyslexic, and
I
so
didn't know that.
yeah, he thought he went through his teenage life thinking that he was really stupid, and of course his teachers reinforced that notion, and the reality is that he was always battling dyslexia. Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. Anyway,
But you were saying he really prided himself in having a legible signature.
yeah, he wanted to always do it. He actually wrote about it somewhere where it was like, I really want to do autographs with this kind of pen. I don't want people to just put a piece of paper in front of me and just, you know, have me sign it. I want something that's like meaningful that I can autograph that will last.
Oh,
you know?
that's that's so touching. We talked earlier
Mm-hmm.
offline in a different conversation about Jackie Stewart in a recent moment at the Miami Grand Prix. And that only makes me love him more and then respect him more
Right.
after hearing this
Right.
story.
Yep.
Wow, that's so cool. I mean, such history
Yep.
regarding F1 that you've just shared in this very short period of time. And I think
Yep.
that is one of the many reasons I personally am so grateful for this podcast, because it's brought our two worlds to intersect. And you and I know this was John's vision. And so I guess my question to you would be is, why did you accept John's invitation to launch this podcast?
So this is a really funny story. So he and I are talking about a business deal, and then he goes, oh, by the way, got this really dear friend of ours, Sabrina. She's been best friends with my daughter for years. She's like another daughter to me. And she's become a Formula One fan, but she doesn't know much about the sport. If she wrote up some questions, would you entertain having the three of us getting on a phone call and answering some of her questions? And I was like, sure, always glad to help out a new fan, and all that kind of stuff. Next thing I know, it's a podcast. And so somehow John either left out that particular piece of information, or I just didn't catch it, or whatever. But here we are. So anyway, but this is great. I love it.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm glad it wasn't just maybe it was she's writing the questions for the podcast. Maybe that little line got left out. But either way, what I have been so delighted is that you did say yes, and that I've gotten to learn from you. And you're just
Sure.
I told you guys, I think offline, I love the way that John often will set the conversation, and then it's like setting the table, and then you bring out different entrees and meals, and it complements each other so much. I know for myself, and I'm hoping that the audience does. That's my hope. What is your hope that the listeners from this podcast will have?
Well, of course, number one, I hope they enjoy it. I operate under the deal. Whenever I do something like this, I always say, look, can we entertain, encourage, inspire, and inform, right? And so that's my hope. If we can hit two of those on each podcast, I think we've got a really solid podcast for folks to listen to. If we can get 3 or 4, we got a winner. And so that's what I'm striving for, and that's hopefully what our listeners are getting out of this. That, you know, some of the color, some of the history. You know, John and I typically think a lot alike, but in some instances, you know, we're going to have a little bit differing opinions, and that's good. That's healthy.
Or if I needle you guys and see if I can put you against one another a little bit too, that'll
work too. That'll work.
That brings me to, what do you think John and I bring to the conversation? Because, you know, there's a lot of podcasts out there for F1, but you're sitting on one stool and a 3-stool table that we're having this, and then the listeners are the 4th kind of listening in as they hear me say. What do you think John and I bring to the conversation?
Well, John certainly brings a really interesting perspective because he actually spent quite a bit of time over in Europe. He raced over in Europe, which is something that I always dreamed of doing but never got the opportunity to. John actually made it happen. Huge respect for that. John's competed in some pretty big time races like the Rolex 24. That I'm still hoping to be able to, you know, find some way to sneak onto a team and do that sometime. But I think he just brings that experience, that European experience as a Texan, which is an interesting combination. And he brings that to the table that I'm not going to be able to bring. For you, number one, I love your enthusiasm. I love the fact that you're just an open book, wanting to ask questions and learn. There's been several times when I've thought to myself, yeah, I'm glad I wasn't competing for grades in school with Sabrina, because she would have smoked me. So
that's so kind.
Yeah, no, it's all good. You know, I was really popular, but I wasn't exactly the best student. So, you know, I think that's what you bring, is that you bring out, you have the ability to ask questions that maybe John and I would just sort of take for granted, right? That we would just pass over. And you ask the really smart questions that are really good and fundamental kind of questions. So yeah, that would be my take on that.
Oh, that's so nice. I think for John, and to hear you speak of him in the way that you did, as someone who, as you noted, has known him and his family for so long, and just has that, I have the utmost respect for him. To hear it from your perspective makes me smile. And then I'm very humbled by your words regarding me. I when I end up turning off our recordings and, you know, sharing with family and friends, I tell them I feel like so loved, and I also just can't believe I get to talk to you guys about all this stuff. It's so much fun. So I think that, especially as I've gone in deeper into the F1 world, I can see that not necessarily all long-term fans are happy as new fans are coming in. I'm not a result of Drive to Survive, but I am coming in kind of during that era. And so I don't take for granted the way that the both of you are gracious, both personally to me, but I also think the podcast is an extension of that. Like, you guys wanting to do something like this is because you want to see the sport thrive and to move into into future eras in such a way that if we don't have this institutional knowledge as fans, it'll be lost. And so that's why I was really excited when you guys offered this opportunity to me. I'm glad to hear that the questions are good, because I keep thinking, if I've got to be asking the questions that the rest of the people out there are probably asking, hopefully if they have questions that I'm not asking,
Right.
they'll reach out and let us know, hey, I'd love to hear the guy's perspective on this. So that leads me
Yeah.
to the future of F1 in America itself. What do you think is really necessary for Americans to become involved, to help them understand the sport? We've mentioned Drive to Survive, it's kind of like a mania, which right now that's kind of obvious, but really for it to not dramatically drop. We both agree that there will likely be some drop at some point in the future, but to really be sustained, how do you think Americans can get involved?
Well, I think it's a number of ways. Because the seats are so limited, it is a closed shop. To say that Formula One will only survive in America because it's got American drivers, I think it's a half truth. It may be even a quarter truth, because people want to see the best of the best compete, right? And they don't really care what their nationality is. But I do think that as more Americans get involved, either as engineers, mechanics, PR people, team principals, we've got 2 team principals right now that are Americans out there. And so I think that just helps the scenario that we're dealing with here, to grow the sport and get people excited about the sport and say, you know what, I may not be able to drive, but I can still be in the sport.
That's right.
And so I think that there's that piece of it. I think that, really at the end of the day, you're going to have that stickiness with the sport the more people understand the sport, right? I mean, it's really, really easy for, any guy or girl to go out and play basketball, and they make it to senior in high school, and then, they don't get picked up by a college. They're probably still going to be a basketball fan. They're still going to pick up a ball every once in a while and shoot some hoops or something like that, or pick up a golf club and hit a golf ball. Right? It's going to be one of those things because they can do it and they can understand it. And I think that from a racing perspective, we need to get more people at least experiencing it at the grassroots level to understand that, hey, this is not like driving my Lexus to the grocery store or to the office, right? There's really very little, other than the fact that there's a steering wheel and a throttle and a gas pedal and a brake pedal. I mean, there's really no comparison. And, I was trying to explain it to somebody the other day, and they're avid golfers. And they don't know anything about racing. I said, okay, think about it this way. You've got to hit an absolutely precise shot every single time that you get up there, because instead of losing a golf ball or getting a 1-stroke penalty, you're going to break your leg. And while you're trying to hit that perfect shot, you got one guy standing in front of you with both hands on your head, shaking your head as hard as he can. You have another guy with a rubber baseball bat hitting you in the ribs. And oh, by the way, because of the G-forces, you weigh 800 pounds, but you got to hit that shot perfectly. And oh, by the way, instead of, hopping on your golf cart and driving down to the next shot, you have to run as hard as you can to the golf ball after you hit it. And then you get to go and do it all over again. And you only got 4 seconds from the time you hit the ball to the next time you hit the ball. And all the time, those guys are shaking you, hitting you, and you weigh 800 pounds. I said, now you get an idea of what that's like. And you have to be perfect every single time. And people don't understand that because it's too easy to drive a streetcar. And so, what I try to do is I just invite people out to the local go-kart track where they've got, some 50 or 60 mile an hour go-karts that are fast enough to give you the impression of speed, but slow enough that you're not going to hurt yourself. And go out and really, really help them to understand how truly difficult it is to drive. But I do that because I'm a fan. I love the sport. It's a way of giving back to the sport. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of what I
did. I was sitting there going, there's no way I could have answered that question the way that you did, of analogizing it to golfing in the way that you did so well. And I think that you pinpointed so much of what I think intuitively I have admired about racing and Formula One, but I could not articulate. Again, this is why I love our conversations and think that you are such a great component to this trio, because of the way that you can paint these pictures that I think can help listeners, myself, novices, to understand better how can we communicate why this is. It's not just watching cars go super fast. It's so much more than that. And
Yes.
the skill that these people are doing, and then you add in all the other components of like the business and the team and I love what you said about earlier about like how if Americans can understand their other roles inside the Formula One world, like engineering, marketing, all of
Right.
that. I think if people saw all that was this sport, they would really have an
Mm-hmm.
even greater level of respect. And I think it goes back to some of the things that you said earlier about the movies, like really bad movies make it seem like, oh, who is it? Some celebrity just jumped in the car and they just got, I think we've been
Right.
desensitized to not understand the power and the skill of driving, both because of what you said, like
Mm-hmm.
jumping in our Lexus, but also TV. And that what we're seeing in the
Yep.
sport of F1 is really
Yep.
that battle between human and machine and science and engineering and all that. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Our time is going, and you and
Yep.
we could keep talking. Maybe we'll do a second conversation because here's
Sure.
what I do know. You are not just talking about the past of racing, you are an active racer. This may
Yep.
be news to anybody listening in on this conversation, is that you're still actively racing and have been doing that for quite some time. Can you give a little
Right.
taste to possibly a future
Yep.
conversation where we will talk about that more?
Absolutely. I started racing when I was 14 years old in racing go-karts and did those for a number of years, and then made the move into Formula cars with the goal of I dreamed of racing at Indianapolis and the Indy 500 and racing in Formula One. I was one of those guys convinced that I was going to win a world championship and I was going to win the Indy 500. And
You still might.
well, yeah, the sand is running out of the sand dial, out of the hourglass. But anyway, for me, I got to two rungs below IndyCar at the time in a class called Formula Ford, and basically ran out of talent and money at the same time. That's a long story, and I'm happy to talk about it. But anyway, many years went by, 30 some odd years went by, and I really felt like I was being called to go back and take care of some unfinished business. And so I just kind of went back to my roots. I got what's called a shifter cart, which is a racing go-kart with a 45 horsepower engine and it has a 6-speed transmission. So it's in all aspects. It's just a very small race car, very fast. Guys like Max Verstappen and all, I mean, they've raced that kind of cart in the United States and won. Charles Leclerc has done it. Michael Schumacher. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And it is every bit as tough as I thought it would be and more. But I'm enjoying myself greatly. I've got one podium. And when I won that podium and I got to stand on the podium, and it was a little club race and it didn't mean anything to anybody else, but I can tell you, that was absolutely amazing. About lost it, quite frankly. Yeah, it was very meaneful.
That is awesome. We have got to talk about that more. And
Okay.
I want to do a part 2 conversation on this,
Sure.
if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay. So let's close out with my final question to you, which is, who are your racing inspirations and why?
3 are not a surprise. The 4th will be a surprise, but Jackie Stewart, obviously, because he was just such a class act, great ambassador for the sport. And he was really the first to go and really pursue driver safety. And it cost him to do that. But he did it because he had the courage of his convictions. And so lots of respect for him. Mario Andretti, he's the man. I mean, if it had 4 wheels, he'd race it and he'd beat you. And it didn't matter if it was on pavement, dirt, whatever. He would find a way to beat you. The guy was a beast. And getting to meet him a year ago was a really big deal for me. Of course, Ayrton Senna, the guy was a magician. He did stuff that I don't think anybody had done before, and I don't really think anybody has done since. He was such a complex character and fearless, and he redefined for the sport what commitment means. Commitment means, I think, but I'm not positive, that I can take this corner flat out in sixth gear, so there's only one way to find out. That's commitment. And he took it to a whole new level. And just like Michael Schumacher took physical fitness to a whole new level, Senna redefined what commitment really looks like. The last guy that was an inspiration for me, nobody's ever heard of, but his name is Leroy Wilkerson. And Leroy was a kart racer from Houston. He lives in Arizona now. He's about a year older than me. My dad referred to him as the Reverend Leroy because every Sunday at the go-kart track, Leroy was teaching Sunday school.
Wow.
He was destroying people. And I mean, he was known from the East Coast to the West Coast as just one of the toughest competitors that you'd ever see. He did things in a go-kart that I've never seen anybody do. The guy was unbelievable. A funny story, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was really thinking about getting into a shifter kart again. I was kind of going, okay, no, I do this. And so I go to the big kart race out in Vegas that they have every November. And I'm out there, and like the second person I bump into that I know is Leroy. And I look at him and he looks at me, and I'm like, what are you doing here? And he goes, I'm doing the same thing you're doing. That's what I'm doing.
Wow.
Sure enough, he bought a cart about the same time I did, and he's racing it out in Arizona. And it's like he told me, he says, the only thing that I have concerns about racing at this age is I really don't want to come across a 19-year-old me.
That's great. Oh,
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but he was my measuring stick, Yep. I've known him since I was 14 years old.
Oh, I love that. That is so, what I've enjoyed about listening to your stories is the collegial, like the almost fraternal bond that I can see runs within the community, especially, going out there, trying the things that you're trying, competing. That's all stuff that I think is good. That's the healthy thing that I think we should be doing.
Sure.
Stuff that I wish more in society we would do. Probably would help us with all the things that we say ails our society, as if we enjoyed some of these sports in the way that you have had the privilege and opportunity to do. Wow. Okay. That will have to wrap up this conversation today.
Okay.
But as I haven't noted, you said we could do a part 2, and I look forward to that conversation, Dick. Thank you so much for your time. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.